On October 13, 1972, a flight carrying 45 passengers and crew was heading to Santiago, Chile, but it never made it. What started as a routine flight turned into one of the most harrowing survival stories in history. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crashed high in the Andes Mountains, and the passengers were forced to face an unimaginable challenge. Stranded in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, their will to survive would be tested in ways no one could ever imagine. What happened to the passengers of Flight 571? How did they survive for 72 days in the freezing, barren mountains, and what lengths did they have to go to in order to stay alive? Stay with us, because this story is one you'll never forget. It was a beautiful autumn afternoon when the flight took off from Montevideo, Uruguay. On board were members of a rugby team, their families, and friends. They were heading to Chile for a match, excited for the adventure ahead. But somewhere over the Andes, disaster struck. The plane hit a mountain ridge, breaking apart and leaving the survivors in a nightmarish landscape, an icy, remote wilderness with no way to communicate with the outside world. The crash left several people injured, some fatally. The survivors, shaken and dazed, had no idea how they were going to get out of this nightmare. The mountains were rugged, and temperatures were plummeting. The first challenge: how to survive the night. As the days passed, the survivors found themselves facing one of the coldest and harshest environments imaginable. With no shelter, limited food, and no way of contacting the outside world, the odds were stacked against them. They made a temporary shelter using the wreckage, but it provided little warmth. By the second day, the food in the wreckage was nearly gone. They were trapped in an ice-cold wasteland, completely cut off from civilization. The survivors knew that they had to make a decision: sit and wait for help, or take action and find a way out. The team tried to survive with whatever they could: scrounge candy, wine, and a small amount of food. But the situation was quickly becoming desperate. Days turned into weeks, and the survivors grew weaker. Their only hope was to wait for rescue, but the weather in the mountains was unforgiving, and rescue teams were not able to reach them. The survivors made a shocking discovery: there was no chance they were going to be rescued in time. They realized they needed to take extreme measures to survive. With no other choice, they made the most heart-wrenching decision imaginable. Faced with hunger, freezing temperatures, and an almost infinite stretch of mountains, the survivors began to cannibalize the bodies of the deceased. This act of survival was the only way they could stay alive, but it came at an enormous moral cost. As the days turned into weeks, the survivors' strength began to fade. They were stuck in the mountains with no food, no shelter, and no hope for help. Yet, their determination to live kept them going, even when everything seemed lost. After many weeks, only a few survivors remained able to walk and move. But the situation was becoming increasingly dire. They couldn't just wait for someone to find them. With no radio and no clear way to signal for help, the survivors made an incredibly brave decision. A small group of them decided to hike through the treacherous mountains to find help. They faced unthinkable dangers: blizzards, freezing temperatures, and the constant risk of falling into deep crevasses or being trapped in avalanches. But the will to survive was stronger than the cold. They trekked for days, moving through the mountains with only hope and sheer determination to guide them. After 10 days of relentless hiking, the survivors finally came across a shepherd in the remote mountains. They were weak, almost unrecognizable from hunger and exhaustion, but they had made it. The shepherd called for help, and soon, a rescue team arrived to save the remaining survivors. In total, 16 people made it out alive, but they had paid a terrible price. The survivors had spent 72 days in the frozen Andes Mountains, enduring conditions most people would never survive. The experience had pushed them to the limits of human endurance. Yet, it was their strength, courage, and willpower that had ultimately kept them alive. The story of Flight 571 became a symbol of human resilience. The survivors, though scarred by the trauma of their ordeal, went on to lead full lives, sharing their story with the world. Their experience was not just about surviving, it was about human spirit, the will to fight against overwhelming odds, and the ability to overcome the most unimaginable challenges. The events of Flight 571 raised profound questions about survival, ethics, and what it truly means to stay alive against all odds. In the years following the crash, the survivors have spoken about their experience in documentaries, books, and interviews, ensuring that the world would never forget the incredible story of how Flight 571 survived the Andes. So, what can we learn from the harrowing tale of Flight 571? The survivor's journey reminds us that, when faced with the unthinkable, we can discover reserves of strength and courage that we never knew existed. In the most desperate of circumstances, even the most difficult decisions can become a path to survival. This is a story of sacrifice, perseverance, and, above all, the power of human will. It's a story that no one who hears it will ever forget. And for those who survived, it will be a part of them for the rest of their lives. If you made it to the end, you've experienced one of the greatest survival stories ever told. The Andes are no longer just a mountain range, they represent the strength of the human spirit and the will to survive, no matter the cost.